Hello, and welcome to the National Archives Foundation's virtual program series. Hopefully you're hearing me and we all missed the wonderful introduction music. I'm Patrick Madden, the Executive Director of the Foundation. We're the nonprofit partner to the National Archives. Through this foundation programming, we are excited to open the doors and bring the more than 15 billion records, objects, films, letters, drawings, photographs, and most importantly, stories from our nation's past. At the National Archives Museum, we are open and the rotunda is rocking. We hope you'll come visit us after a long delay. The crowds are back, tourists are back, and we are loving seeing everyone at the Archives Museum. If you're going to visit, we hope you'll check out what's going on and what's coming up at archivesfoundation.org. And I'll have more details at the end, but we are ramping up our virtual programs, some more things coming up in May and June. So I hope you'll sign up, hit that subscribe button on your YouTube, our YouTube channel there, so you don't miss anything we've got cooking. We appreciate you joining us. I see a lot of our old friends are back with us. And as you know, we are going to take questions later on from our speaker. So throw your hometown there in the chat. I've got a great list going so far. Love to see the national audience. Put your hometown and state in there, and I'll give folks a shout out in a little bit. Tonight's program is a look at the archives, records, and immigrant experience in the census. There's a lot of excitement at the National Archives the last few weeks. Hopefully you haven't been under a rock, but having reached the 72-year hold on the census records, the 1950 census was released on April 1st. The archives has digitized the 1950 census, and users have free online access to population schedules for the states and territories, enumeration district maps, enumeration district descriptions at a special website, 1950census.archives.gov. And we'll throw that on the screen a little bit later. I was there for the first time, and I will tell you, it works. I typed in my grandparents' name, hometown, and sure enough, I found him. I love seeing the occupations. He wrote himself in as a bread salesman, which was a little bit of an understatement considering he ran the town bakery with his name on it. But I did find him and my mom and her sisters and brother there. So of course I went down the rabbit hole, and a couple hours later I came back up and realized I needed to get back to real life, but there's so much to discover with it. So I hope you'll check it out at 1950census.archives.gov. In addition to tonight's program, the Archives has a lot of programming that they're offering for free online, focused on the 1950 census. The genealogy series provides research tools for all skills levels. Don't be intimidated. There are 7 sessions that span from general overview to very specific topics. They started in March and they'll go through May, and you can check those out on the Archives YouTube channel. And they're also available at archives.gov, where they are archived. That's what we do. Along with the videos, the session handouts are also available. One of our NAR friends will post the link in the chat, so everyone has that as well. So before we get started, I want to make sure, we're going to be talking about aliens tonight, and this program should not be confused by a program we have yet to schedule that is going to talk about the end of the Raiders of the Lost Ark and National Treasure. So we're going to get all kind of specific there, but that is a totally different program if that's why you tuned in. Now, our speaker is legit. Elizabeth Burns is an archivist for the Archives in Kansas City. She serves as the Research Services Division subject matter expert on immigration records. She's the pro. She's the lead archivist for Alien Files, also known as the A-Files. We'll hear more about that. She received a bachelor's degree in history from Truman State University and a master's in history and museum studies at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. Elizabeth, are you there?
I am. Hello, Patrick.
Hello, hello. We are excited to have you here with us. I have to ask, people are always curious, everybody is doing things a little bit differently in different parts of the country. How are the archives out where you are?
We're doing great out here in Kansas City, Missouri. The research room has reopened, and we have been so excited to see both new and familiar faces coming into the research room to start using records again. We hope that we'll see some of you soon.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I know you have some things to lay it all out for us, so I'm going to pass the screen to you, and then we'll jump back. And I want to remind folks you can ask your questions in the chat as she's going. You don't have to wait until she's done. That way, we'll get sort of a queue of questions going. So the screen is all yours.
Thanks, Patrick. All right. Count everyone. That's really the goal of taking a national census. Everyone meant immigrants as well as citizens. Before Patrick and I have a conversation about different immigrant experiences, I want to provide some background and context for the relationship of the federal census records and immigrant records broadly. Slide. We'll start with a quick note about census records. Slide. Taken every 10 years since 1790, the US Census provides a snapshot of the nation's population. Because of a 72-year restriction on access to the records, the most recent census year currently available is 1950. As Patrick mentioned, I'm sure some of you have started a search in the 1950 census since its April 1st release. It may even be the first year that you yourself appear in a federal census. I know I've been perusing the forums looking for familiar individuals. The 1950 census, though, was the last time that enumerators personally visited most households with large multifamily census sheets. During the 1960 and later censuses, households received enumeration forms in the mail and mailed them back to the Census Bureau. Slide. So, how are immigrants reflected in the large multifamily census sheets that many of us have become familiar with searching? The best way of approaching that answer is to look at the kinds of questions asked and the answers that census takers were offering. Slide. Country of birth is certainly a piece of information that can point to the individual being an immigrant. Foreign birthplace is an obvious clue that the person immigrated to the US sometime between birth and the date of the census. Each person's state or country of birth is reported on the 1850 through the 1950 censuses. It's very important to locate persons of interest in all available censuses during which the person resided in the US. The country of birth can honestly be reported differently in different census years. For example, Germany versus Prussia, or France versus the province Alsace-Lorraine. It's also important to consider shifting national boundaries, as country of birth can be reported under the national boundary that existed during that census year, or may possibly be reported under the boundary that existed at the time the person was born or lived there. This was dependent on the instructions given to the enumerator, as well as the responding person's knowledge. For example, the 1950 census enumerators were instructed to write the name of the foreign country or US territory according to the 1950 international boundaries. Locating the instructions for the enumerators can be extremely useful in understanding how individuals were reported. Considering the responding person's knowledge is also important, though, because country of birth can be inaccurate if it was reported by another family member who was not well informed. So be sure to take the enumerator's source into consideration as you evaluate census records, and you may want to take some of the responses with a grain of salt. One final quick note on country of birth is that born at sea is sometimes indicated. If true, it's a great clue for narrowing time frame of arrival to the US. But as I just referenced, it can sometimes be inaccurate. A colleague told me about a researcher they worked with who had found an ancestor on the 1880 census noted as born at sea to Scottish-born parents. However, all of the other census records for that man indicated that he was born in New York State. The researcher had also determined that an older brother was born in New York. The researcher ultimately concluded that born at sea statement may have been part of a tall tale that the man told his wife and in-laws. Once you've considered location of birth, there are other clues the census can offer about the immigrant experience. Slide. On the 1900 to 1930 censuses, a year of immigration is recorded in the citizenship column on the census form. This date can help narrow the focus of a search for passenger arrival or border crossing records. Locating an immigrant's record of arrival on a ship passenger list from 1820 to the 1950s, a Canadian border crossing record from 1895 to the 1950s, or a Mexican border crossing record from 1903 to the 1950s requires knowing the immigrant's name at the time of arrival, their approximate year of birth, and their approximate date of immigration. The more accurate the information, the more likely you'll find the correct person. As with country of birth, finding an immigrant year on a census is a great clue, but you do have to consider the source of the information. And keep in mind that even the immigrant themselves may not remember accurately. You can approximate year of immigration to the census or immigration to the US based on their first appearance in the US Census, though. For example, if a couple's older children were reported as foreign born and their younger children were reported as US born, you can make a general assumption that the couple and their older children immigrated to the US between the last foreign born child's birth and the first US born child's birth. However, the whole family unit may not have immigrated together. Sometimes the husband may have immigrated first, with the wife and children following later. Slide. Naturalization is a voluntary legal process through which an immigrant becomes a U.S. citizen. Information on a person's naturalization status in the census records can help focus research to a specific time span and narrow a search to courts in a specific geographic area near the person's residence. Several censuses indicate a date of naturalization and/or naturalization status. The 1820 and 1830 census report the number of foreigners not naturalized in the household. Although the specific persons who were foreigners are not indicated, this is a clue to search for household members in immigration records, pay attention to clues in other records that point to foreign origins, and to search for possible later naturalization records. As a quick note, there are relatively few immigration records before January 1st of 1820, when the federal government began requiring that passenger lists be presented to the collectors of customs. It's just a date to keep in mind as you begin your research. Another clue from the 1900 census records is that the 1870 census indicates with a check mark male citizens of the US of 21 years of age and upwards. So, if a man was a foreign-born citizen, this means that he had become naturalized by 1870. Slide. From the 1900 to 1950 censuses, a naturalization status is recorded for individuals. The status recorded is a good starting point for determining whether an individual may have pursued U.S. citizenship. The answer for naturalization status on the 1900 to 1940 census were recorded as AL, which indicates alien, PA, which indicates first papers had been filed, and NA, which indicate that the person had completed naturalization. They had submitted their second papers. On the 1950 census, naturalization status was indicated with yes, no, or AP for born abroad of American parents. As a quick aside, in the 1940 census, sometimes you'll see the code AMCIT, AMCIT, and that was used in cases of individuals born to American parents as well. Just as a quick point of clarification, a yes response in 1950 indicates that a person had filed a petition for naturalization, also called second papers, or that they were naturalized through a parent when the person was a minor. Slide. In addition to indicating naturalization status at the time the census was taken, these clues suggest when the person's naturalization status changed. For example, if an ancestor is listed as an alien, AL, in the 1920 census, and then listed as PA or NA in subsequent censuses, you know to look for naturalization records for that person after 1920. The images on the slide are a zoomed-in view of the citizenship column for the 1900 through 1940 censuses. You can see the information recorded does vary census to census, but pulling clues from these fields and using them as a crosswalk into other records about the same person or family unit is a key to solid immigrant research. Slide. So, what's the thought process you need to use to connect the census with other immigrant records? Slide. Jumping off from the census, you can draw a number of lines between the details recorded and other record sets at the National Archives. I've mentioned immigration and naturalization records explicitly, but you can expand more broadly to topics like enemy alien records during World War I and World War II, visa records, alien files, which are more commonly called A files, passport applications, and beyond. The Immigrant Records webpage on archives.gov is a wonderful starting point for wrapping your mind around the high-level possibilities, as it's important to keep in mind that the records created and maintained by federal agencies can vary drastically over time. Slide. I thought that a case study might be a nice way to show you how I approach making connections from census records. In this case, I started with some basic information. Florence Dorothy Martin, maiden name Coates, born April 28, 1898 in London, England, lived in Chicago, Illinois, married to James Martin on October 6, 1924 in Canada, had one child named James Martin Jr., who was born September 27, 1925, also in Canada, and died September 16, 1956 in Los Angeles, California. Looking at this basic biographical snapshot, here are the details that immediately stood out to me. We see that she's noted as foreign-born, but that she resided in Chicago and Los Angeles in the United States, which clearly points to her being an immigrant. We see that she was residing outside the US in 1925, so it may be safe to assume that she did not have her legal arrival for permanent residence in the US until after that point. Since she was outside the US in the 1920s, my first thought would be to check for her in the 1930 census. Slide. I quickly found Florence, James, and James Jr. living in Chicago in the 1930 census. We can see England listed as her country of birth, again confirming foreign origins. She also has information recorded in the citizenship column on the form. We can see a 1929 year of immigration listed, as well as an AL, indicating alien status at the time. To be thorough, I did go back to the 1920 census as well, but as I expected, I could not find Florence living in the US during that census year. Since I did find the family in 1930, I moved on to checking the 1940 census to watch for additional clues that may be useful in beginning my search for immigrant records. Slide. In the 1940 census, we again find Florence, James, and James Jr. living in Chicago. Florence still has England noted as her country of birth, but we can see in the citizenship column, the entire family is now noted as NA, or naturalized. The NA indicator means we can definitely include a search for naturalization records in our research process. Since Florence was noted as alien status in 1930 and naturalized status in 1940, we now also have the 10-year time frame between 1930 and 1940 for when she obtained citizenship. Additionally, we can use Chicago as a geographic starting point for a search for naturalization records. Slide. The National Archives at Chicago maintains naturalization records from the federal court in Chicago, and I was able to locate Florence's declaration of intention with associated certificate of arrival, seen at left on the slide, as well as her petition for naturalization front and back, seen at right on the slide. A quick note, when you locate digitized naturalization records online, whether it be through the National Archives catalog or one of our partners' web pages, you need to take time to move forward and backward through the images to ensure that you're capturing the entire record for an individual. Florence's naturalization record from the court is 4 pages long, but I often find researchers have only captured 1 or 2 pages within the set of available images, and that means you could have large gaps in your knowledge. For example, depending on the version of the form in use at the time, the petition for naturalization can have some of the most useful clues regarding citizenship status on the back of the form. In this case, we can see that Florence took her oath of allegiance and successfully obtained citizenship on May 19th, 1936, receiving Certificate of Naturalization 4045317. Certificates of naturalization do not normally appear in National Archives holdings, but starting September 27, 1906, they will appear in files created by the Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS. From September 27th, 1906 to March 31st, 1956, a copy of the court record as well as the certificate were filed into a certificate file, or C file. And beginning April 1st, 1956, naturalization records were consolidated into an alien file, or A file. In Florence's case, we can use her petition as yet another jumping off point and look to order her 1936 certificate file. C files are currently maintained by the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services genealogy program. As you research, you'll start to see these interconnections of so many of the immigrant records, both inside and outside of our holdings. As I studied the declaration, petition, and certificate of arrival, I noted that they all listed an August 1st, 1928 arrival at Detroit, Michigan. Beginning in 1929, when a declaration of intention was filed, a certificate of arrival was required to verify legal immigration. The Department of Justice would locate an arrival manifest and certify their results. So my next step was working on trying to locate Florence's correlating 1928 arrival record. Before we look toward immigration records, though, I want to draw your attention to the notation at the bottom right of the highlighted block from the certificate of arrival. The VFP 457584 points to a visa record. The large majority of Department of State visa records were deemed temporary and destroyed before transfer to the National Archives. But the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services genealogy program maintains copies of the Immigration and Naturalization Service visa files from 1924 to 1944. Another jumping off point to consider. Slide. Since I knew that Florence had been residing in Canada during 1925 and that her naturalization records indicated arrival at Detroit, I focused my efforts on Canadian border crossing records. I located this arrival manifest indicating the arrival of Florence and James Jr. at Detroit on August 1st, 1928. I was, of course, pleased to find this record, but you may recall that on the 1930 census, Florence was noted with a 1929 arrival to the U.S. Now, August of 1928 and the year 1929 are close dates, so it was certainly a possibility that the year had been misremembered on the census. But you always want to cover your bases in research and attempt to follow every path laid in front of you, just in case. Slide. In this case, I was glad that I went the extra step to check 1929 arrivals. I didn't find any border crossing records, so I opened my search up broadly to all passenger arrivals and found Florence and James Jr. arriving at the Port of New York on December 14th, 1929. It turned out that Florence had gone to visit a cousin in England and was returning to the U.S. aboard the SS Cameronia. If you locate a ship passenger manifest, it's always worthwhile to look around online to see if you can locate a vessel image as well. I always find it's kind of helpful to get a visual of the ship that an immigrant actually traveled on. And again, as a researcher, make sure that you're capturing all relevant digital content by moving forward and backward through the images. These manifest documents carry across 2 separate pages online. This particular arrival record supports our census findings in a couple of ways, because Florence notes that she's a British citizen and that she has permanent residency in the US at Chicago, Illinois. You may also see on the zoomed in inset that 457584 visa number that tied to her 1928 arrival that we had seen earlier on Florence's certificate of arrival. Again, those interconnections and movements between the different record types can be wonderful if you pay attention to the really small details. Slide. Hopefully, seeing how I approach the search using Florence's census records gives you some new insights into your own research process. And I honestly do hope that you'll take some time to explore. Patrick, I know that you have some questions for me about some of the immigrant experiences that I've mentioned, so I'll jump into my conversation with you now.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much. I do have questions. I love Florence. We might call her Flo from now on. I want to encourage our visitors or our viewers that we're looking for your questions. I've got some, but I don't want to scoop up all the time. And I want to welcome folks from around the country. I have to start off with aloha to our friends in Hawaii who are who are tuned in. We got folks from Philly, Pittsburgh, obviously the Washington, D.C. metro area, Eastern Kansas, Chicago, let's see, New York, Oregon, San Francisco, Palo Alto area, Greeley, Colorado, Dallas, Seattle, Rolla, Missouri, Jacksonville, New Hampshire. I think we've got the whole country covered, and we've got, I know, a lot of archives facilities in these various spots around the country as well. So let's talk a little bit. The example of Florence was great because it makes it very tangible. So appreciate like walking us through that. So I have a couple specific things that came up, and I am not a major researcher, genealogist, so these might be very one-on-one for you, but hopefully they'll help the viewers. You mentioned naturalization. Obviously, it's a legal process, and I saw that there was a Chicago connection there. Are all those records like always in the federal court? Is that something someone should keep in mind?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it actually highlights a couple of issues that researchers face. One thing that I want to mention is that naturalization is not required. It's always been an optional process. You cannot assume that every individual ultimately became a US citizen. And you are correct, it is a legal process that took place in court. Prior to September 27th, 1906, any court of record, municipal, county, state, or federal, could grant US citizenship. Often petitioners just went to the court that was most geographically convenient for them. From 1790 through most of the 20th century, naturalization was a two-step process. After residing in the US for 2 years, an alien could file their declaration of intention to become a US citizen. After 3 additional years, the alien could file a petition for naturalization. The petition was either granted or denied. The two steps didn't have to take place in the same court or even in the same state. But beginning September 27th, 1906, US naturalization law imposed a fee structure that encouraged the transfer of naturalization to federal courts. It did take some time for lower courts to let go of the practice, so researchers may need to look at lower courts if the National Archives does not maintain a record of naturalization from probably around the mid 20th century. But you can learn more about naturalization and where to locate records by visiting that main immigrant records webpage that I referenced in the slides.
Great. And then sort of related to that, in the Archives Museum in DC, there's some tremendous immigration records and court records that talk about the impact of the courts in women and men in naturalization. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I know it depends on what period you're looking at.
Yes, yeah. The laws around naturalization definitely impacted women and men differently. From 1790 until September 22nd of 1922, a woman's citizenship status was determined by the citizenship status of her father or husband. Before September 1922 or September 22nd, 1922, a foreign-born woman became a U.S. citizen when she married a U.S. citizen or when her foreign-born husband became naturalized. She could also lose her US citizenship by marrying an alien. So if you find a woman listed specifically on the 1900 through 1920 censuses as naturalized, you'll really want to keep in mind and consider when and how her father or spouse obtained US citizenship. In a lot of cases where a woman derived her US citizenship from a father or spouse, it's not uncommon for there to be no formal record from the courts of the derivation. Her birth or marriage certificate and the father or husband's proof of citizenship would essentially serve as her proof of citizenship.
Okay. And then, and I was sort of thinking about this as you were talking during your presentation. I just saw a question come up about this. So she traveled, obviously, and it's something like a land border crossings, a passport. Are those documents people should be thinking about trying to find? If so, how? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. In the case of Florence's 1929 departure and reentry that I talked about, there would have been no US passport that would have existed. As a general rule, the US government only issued passports to US citizens, and Florence wasn't yet a naturalized citizen in 1929. There are two exceptions to keep in mind to that citizenship rule for passports, and they were that during 2 periods of time, aliens who had declared their intention to become a naturalized citizen could obtain a US passport. There was a congressional act in 1863 that was repealed in 1866, and then again, a congressional act in 1907 that was repealed in 1920. So during those 2 periods, if someone said, I want to be a US citizen, they could get a US passport. It's also relevant to note that as a general rule, until 1941, US citizens were not required to have a passport for travel abroad. There were two exceptions to this. Passports were required during the Civil War, 1861 to 1862, and again from 1918 to 1921 during World War I. So for Florence, a passport application wouldn't have been relevant when we saw her traveling in 1929, but it could certainly be relevant once she obtained her US citizenship because she clearly had family residing abroad that she was keeping in contact with. If you're looking for passport records, the National Archives maintains copies of passport applications dated 1795 through March of 1925, while the Department of State maintains passport records from April 1925 to present. That Immigrant Records webpage is really a good place to get guidance on searching for and locating passport applications. But looping back to Florence's 1929 arrival, although a US passport isn't applicable, she would have been required to have a valid visa for entry to the US. And you can actually see a reference to her 1929 visa number on that passenger manifest that I had located. It was kind of alongside that 1928 number that I mentioned. A little background on visas, except for a brief time during the Civil War. Before World War I, aliens were not required to have visas to enter the US. The practice requiring all aliens to obtain visas from US officials abroad before their departure for the US began in 1917 as a war measure during World War I, and it has just continued since then.
Okay. Shifting gears a little bit, you mentioned the or reference enemy alien records, and how relevant would those be? And then talk a little bit. I know you said things are a little bit different. World War I, World War II. Can you just provide a little more detail for folks?
Definitely, yeah. So during times of war, all native citizens, denizens, or subjects of countries with which the United States is at war are deemed by the federal government as alien enemies, also known as enemy aliens. British subjects were enemy aliens during the War of 1812. German nationals and their allies, including Austrian, Hungarian, Bulgarian, and Turkish citizens, were enemy aliens during World War I. And natives of Germany, Italy, and Japan were enemy aliens during World War II. The federal government instituted enemy alien control programs during World War I and World War II. This generally subjected aliens to additional regulations, increased scrutiny, and required registration and/or internment. When you're making that tie-in with the census records, if you locate a person in the 1920 census who is listed as an alien, AL, in the citizenship column, and their country of birth is Germany or a German allied country, it should certainly be a consideration to look for enemy alien records in the years prior. During World War I, this could include enemy alien registration affidavits, permits to reside and work within restricted zones, and records of internments. If you locate a person on the 1940 or the 1950 census who's listed as an alien and their country of birth is Germany, Japan, or Italy, again, enemy alien records should be a consideration. During World War II, this can include records of internments, records of exclusion and restriction, and even documentation from alien files, such as applications for certificates of identity that were issued to enemy aliens in 1942. Records of enemy aliens appear in a lot of places across the National Archives. So the main immigrant webpage that I reference is really a great place to get your bearings for which offices might be relevant for your search.
Okay, and I want to encourage our folks. We seem to have some shy viewers. Feel free to put your questions in there. I've got a couple queued up. I'm going to ask one more question because I did make light of it before I introduced you. The A files are alien files, and the enemy alien regulations. Like, are these interconnected? They're not. It feels like they're not, but they're very closely. So just language here. I think I want to make sure I'm clear.
Yeah, you're right. They are not connected. They are a separate conversation point, but it is honestly one that researchers often conflate. The 1940 alien registration required every immigrant aged 14 and up residing in the US to visit their local post office and register their alien status with the federal government. completed between August and December of 1940. Government officials expected a few million registrations to occur, but final count saw over 5 million registration forms submitted. As part of that process, each person was assigned an alien registration number, and then beginning April 1st of 1944, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS, utilized the alien registration numbers to begin creating alien files, more commonly called A files. The initial intent of A files was to track the immigration and inspection process for immigrants, but ultimately the files reflect the interactions of the individual with INS and a variety of other federal agencies. Although the files were created beginning in 1944, they can document actions in the immigrant's life from birth all the way to any final action, such as naturalization, deportation, permanent residency, or death. Sometimes researchers are disappointed when they find that an individual is continuously listed on the census records with alien status because they're concerned that there won't be any additional records they can locate. But I'm always excited when that's the case, because an alien status in the 1940 and 1950 census immediately triggers me to check for an A file. The A files have started transferring to the National Archives for permanent retention, and all A files currently maintained by the National Archives are indexed and name searchable in our online catalog. That A files webpage that links out from the main immigrant records site is a good place to start gathering information and determining next steps in your search.
Okay, and I know this has come up a couple times in the chat. We answered it, but wanted to make sure everyone knows that the slides will be available afterwards. Lots of folks want the handouts. They always want the handouts because lots of important links. So let me jump to some of the questions. This is the quiz show moment here where we get to see your expertise. You can flex for us a little bit. So a couple questions about the 120 files. What are they, and how does one start researching them?
The 120 files.
120 files. That came up twice.
Twice.
Let me see if I can scroll up here for a second and find that.
I was going to say, that is a good question. I would need a little more context for that.
Okay, so we'll ask our no, that's fine. We'll ask our questioner to see if they can give us a little bit more context without revealing any personal information, and we'll come back to that one. Thank you for not making up an answer. I after almost 9 years at the Archives Foundation, I'm still amazed that I can come across in preparing for this conversation the acronyms that exist that are not necessarily NARS, but the governments, can be overwhelming. So we've stumped the expert. That's a good thing. So I've got another question about unpacking country of birth. So it might be listed as something that might be considered different today. How should one approach that?
Yeah, that's just something to keep in mind. And again, I feel like the most important key there is to find them in as many census years as you can so that you can try to bridge the gap of how the country of birth may have been recorded. Like I said, because of changing national boundaries, specifically in Europe, but also other locations too, you really have to take into consideration how they were recording that country of birth so that you can get a good read on where the person was actually coming from. Because you don't want to, take a deep dive down a path thinking that somebody was from, I'm trying to think like you're researching a German family that may have lived in the Volga region. And, you have to make that consideration of were they considered Russian or were they considered German? And, this is one of those times where really keeping track of how they were being recorded can give you some clues. And you can start to piece together between the different kinds of immigrant records. Where did the person actually originate? And that can help you make that leap across the ocean to start doing research on the foreign side.
Great. A couple questions about Canadian border crossing. So someone had a relative come from Prince Edward Island. Another question about, is there a place where one can find records related to Canadian border crossings?
So Canadian border crossings are kind of interesting. The way that they tend to be recorded is that they might show up as a crossings at St. Albans, Vermont. but that doesn't mean that they came over at that specific location. It could be any of the northern points. They just kind of umbrellaed them all under this title. So when you're looking for Canadian border crossing records and you come across that St. Albans, don't immediately go, oh no, I don't think that would be relevant to me, because that's all the northern border ports. And so it's good to just stay open-minded to that. The vast majority of the Canadian border crossing records have been digitized and are available online. Some are starting to make their way through to the National Archives catalog, but you can find them all on websites like Ancestry.com. I believe FamilySearch.org also has some as well. So, just be sure that you're keeping your eyes out and considering the Canadian border crossing records, because sometimes you may think that somebody came across and maybe ended up at New York, but really they may have come into a Canadian port and then made their way south into the US. So it's good to keep that in mind. There is also a really wonderful article on the archives.gov webpage. If you go to the immigration, that main immigrant records landing page, and go to the immigration link and select Canadian border crossings, you'll find that article. And it really gives you some good context for how and when those records were created and what border ports you should be expecting, those land border ports that would come up in your search.
Great. Well, while you were answering, Team Genealogy in the chat has been mulling over this 120 files, and it is now reported maybe they are 129, the old INS district files.
Oh, 129 files. Yes. Okay. So 129 files, they are a part of the certificate files, the C files that I had talked about, those naturalization records that were created from 1906 to 1956. 129 files are actually a little more specific in their time frame because they specifically relate to repatriations. So in this case, we're actually talking about women who lost their US citizenship and were repatriating and regaining US citizenship, and the paperwork that went into that process. As I mentioned, 1922 was when the law came into play that gave women their own individual rights to citizenship. And it wasn't really a formalized process until 1938 that repatriation truly became a formal process that had its own forms. But once somebody was pursuing that and wanted to regain citizenship that may have been lost, due to marriage or another scenario, mostly due to marriage, they would have these 129 files created that would document that repatriation process. And in some cases, those 129 records may end up in things like alien files. If for some reason INS ended up creating documentation for that person for another reason, sometimes you'll find them separate, sometimes you'll find them consolidated into another record. But yeah, that makes a lot more sense, 129s.
Excellent. I want to encourage, we have a couple more minutes for questions. So I want to encourage folks to ask us, put your questions in the chat, please. And if I missed a question or two, but by all means, throw it in there again if I haven't asked it yet. In the meantime, let me just ask you, you've talked a lot about the website, obviously. Folks are asking about cheat sheets. I know there's tons of videos online. Obviously, you're creating videos now about the 1950 census, but there's lots of 101 stuff. There's the genealogy fair. Do you want to just talk generally about some of the resources that are on archives.gov?
Yeah, there are some fantastic things that you can utilize through the archives.gov webpage. I would honestly just suggest going and go poke around a little bit. When you go to the main National Archives webpage, if you don't go straight to that immigrant records link that I've provided, on the page, one of the columns there is Research Our Records. And when you click on that, you'll see all kinds of guides and tools and things that can help you in your path researching. That can include, like Patrick said, lots of videos. There are some great resources out there. The National Archives, a number of years ago, started doing virtual genealogy fairs, and there's a lot of good resources that came out of that. There's also a video series that's called Know Your Records, and it's another great way to kind of dip your toes into different kinds of record sets that exist across our agency. When it comes to other kind of finding aids and tools, if you're able to figure out the National Archives office that could maintain records related to where, let's say, an immigrant that you're researching resided, you can go to the website for that office. So for example, my office, the National Archives at Kansas City, if you go to our main page, you can see we've highlighted some of the records that are most utilized. This includes naturalization records, bankruptcy records, patent files, alien files, which are my personal favorite, and a variety of other things. But within those, we've included some other tools that you can use. In some cases, that can include name indexes. That could just be a guide to how to do the research. There's really a lot of things out there, but it just takes a little bit of poking sometimes. But you're also welcome to connect directly with staff. The National Archives staff are happy to help. We're here to support you in your research. And sometimes we have different tools and things that we can share via email as well.
That's great. Just as a carry on to that, so why would I come to Kansas City versus Fort Worth versus DC?
So that's a great question. A lot of people will ask and kind of assume that maybe all the locations have the same things, but we don't. There's really not that much crossover between our offices. The Washington, D.C. and College Park, Maryland locations are our headquarters, and they maintain headquarter level records for the agencies that they have records from, hundreds of different federal agencies, and they maintain that highest level. When you come out to the field sites, like my office in Kansas City, what you're seeing are records that were created in the day-to-day workings of those local regional offices. There are cases where we are consolidating records in specific locations, but there's still a lot of cases where when you're looking out at the field sites, you want to think about what state am I interested in that I'm wanting to get information for? Because in a lot of cases, the records are regionalized based geographically. So my office in Kansas City, we have a lot of records out of Missouri, Kansas, Iowa, Nebraska, some out of the Dakotas and Minnesota. So you'll kind of want to think about your geographic areas and contact the National Archives office that's closest in a lot of cases to that place. But yeah, there's a lot of interesting and exciting things across all the offices. And so I definitely suggest that people keep your mind open and consider all the options when you're looking at the National Archives.
And just to circle back to something you said about the courts, so because the archives facilities and locations are regional based, those federal court records would be there?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, by and large, the records are going to be located in the geographic area where the court was. Now, there are some loopholes. For example, they're consolidating all of the bankruptcy records, all of the Court of Appeal records. Those are all coming to my office in Kansas City. But generally speaking, you can start your search out in the field at the office that would have covered that area and then work from there.
Okay. And then I've got a couple last questions here before we wrap up. And I'm getting seconds and thirds here on the chat, so I have to ask this one. If someone came from Prussia, would they be under German immigration records?
Technically, yes, they could be, depending on the time frame.
Okay, excellent. And then have you found in your research uncovered any consequences for people who did not participate or get counted in the census?
For not getting counted in the census, I can't think of any consequences that I've seen. There are consequences for other things. For example, I mentioned the 1940 alien registration, and there were consequences if you did not register in the 1940 registration. So I don't know that I've ever seen any formal consequences for not being counted in the census, but there are consequences in other arenas.
Sure. Okay, and let me see if I can make this a speed round here. Where would you look for someone who came in through Ellis Island? It's a softball.
Ellis Island, yeah. So the Ellis Island Foundation has a webpage you can utilize. A lot of those records have also been digitized and are available both through the National Archives catalog and our partner web pages. You'll be looking for the Port of New York.
And I think you said this during the presentation, so I'll just give you a chance to say it. When did naturalization begin to be recorded on the census?
1900 was the first year where you really technically see naturalization or naturalization status being recorded. There are hints at it in prior ones, but really 1900 to 1950 is where you're getting a clear indication.
Okay, great. Well, I think I've grilled you enough here. Before we wrap up, I have to give you a minute or two. We're going to post the slides. We've mentioned some websites, but I think you've mentioned like come talk to us at the archives, email us. We've provided some of the websites for sort of the breakdown here, but I know the archives has other resources. So who are you going to call? Who are you going to email? Close us out with those sources for everybody.
Yeah, so if you are trying to make some of those census and immigrant connections, you've studied the census, you've reviewed the main immigrant records webpage on archives.gov, and you're really trying to narrow in on a specific set of records, and you just don't know which National Archives office that you need to talk to, there are two broad approaches that I'm going to suggest that will get you on the right track. First, we invite you to explore our History Hub website. It's historyhub.history.gov. The site is a crowdsourced history and genealogy research community. It is free and open to anyone. You can ask questions and you'll get answers from multiple sources, including National Archives staff, other archives, libraries, museums, and really a large community of genealogists and historians. But you are also welcome to just email us directly. Our main email account is inquire@nara.gov, and your request will be forwarded to the appropriate office or staff person so that they can assist you directly in your research.
This is terrific. Well, thank you for the time, the knowledge, getting a lot of kudos in the chat. And we have some, what I like to say, jokers in the chat asking if we're going to archive this. Of course, this is what we do. This will be available on our YouTube channel. And check back in the description and the RSVP page that we had for this program, because we'll put those links in there, cross-checking slides, links to the archives, everything that Elizabeth has mentioned, and the emails and so forth. Great tips, great insights. Literally, the discoveries at the archives never end. I mean, that's your job, right? Every day you get to go and make discoveries, and of course support others who are looking for their loved ones. So thank you for your time and your insights. And I have a feeling we might have you back again now that we've gotten a little taste of all that you can share with us. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Patrick.
And I want to make sure we remind folks about visiting the 1950 census, just out, not even a month yet, 1950census.archives.gov. So just a few announcements before we close out. I want to thank the sponsor of this evening's program, Denise Ferguson. Thank you for making this program possible. One of our favorite donors. Also want to acknowledge all of our generous members, corporate supporters, and donors. If you'd like to become a member of the foundation, you can do that by joining today at our website, archivesfoundation.org. I see our screen share is not really working right now, so listen closely at what else is coming up. The National Archives Museum, as I mentioned before, is open. The rotunda is full. We're loving seeing all the visitors and tourists back, so please come visit us if you're coming to Washington. There's a terrific featured document exhibit about Matthew Brady and his photography up right now. And starting just this week, we have a very rare copy of the Bill of Rights from New Hampshire. It was printed when New Hampshire was ratifying the Bill of Rights. And so it's a very special presentation that's now available in our Records of Rights exhibit on the first floor. Come stick with us on May 12th at 5 o'clock. We've got a little bit more genealogy, A Path to the Past, Finding Family at the Archives. So I hope you'll tune in for that. Please register so we can let you know the updates for that. And then in June, as I mentioned, we have a number of things that we'll be announcing shortly, and you'll want to tune in for that. If you haven't caught what we're up to, you can follow us on social, Archives FDN, or visit our website to get our weekly emails. And you know I'm going to say this, those of you who've tuned in before, we have the best museum shop in Washington and online. Whether there's genealogy, our presidential collection, cherry blossom, or patriotic gear, get shopping. And for the first 50 shoppers, we've got some free shipping going on right now, archivestore.org. The National Archives is our nation's memory. What is past is prologue. Thank you on behalf of the National Archives Foundation for joining us today.